Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 6th Dean's Lecture for 2015. I'm David Beckett. I'm the Deputy Dean, Acting Dean at the moment, because Field is overseas on leave for a fortnight. And it's my great pleasure to step into his role for the evening. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay respects to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who may be present in the room. Tonight is a special night for our speaker, Professor Hamish Coates, as he will be delivering his inaugural professorial lecture. Hamish Coates is a Professor of Higher Education at the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education. A bit about Hamish. Over the past 16 years, he's worked across 40 countries, authored over 200 publications, and led around 50 influential projects that have shaped scholarship, policy and practice. He has given around 200 keynotes and he's sought internationally as a speaker. He completed his PhD here in 2005 and did some subsequent executive training at INSEAD and the Melbourne Business School. He also holds a graduate certificate in management, a Master of Education, a Bachelor of Science, and probably to start it all off, the Bachelor of Arts with Honours, which, as we all know, is a wonderful foundation for almost everything. Hamish was founding director of Higher Education Research at the Australian Council for Education Research, ACER, from 2006 to 2013, and between 2010 and 2013 was also the LH Martin Institute Program Director for Tertiary Education and Management. Hamish is a specialist in assessment and evaluation and focuses on improving the quality and productivity of learning, academic work and leadership. He is considered an authority in several areas and has active interest in large-scale evaluation, quality and productivity, student admissions and engagement, outcomes assessment, academic work and leadership, and assessment methodology. So, teaching across all levels, Hamish works with executive teams and leads research, supervises graduate students, contributes to advisory groups and serves on various editorial academic committees, and has held visiting fellowships at the University of Michigan and UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning. I've asked Hamish's colleague and friend, Pro-Vice-Chancellor Professor Richard James, who is the Director of the Centre for the Study of Higher Education, to thank Hamish at the conclusion of the lecture, and I'm delighted that he's agreed to do that. So please join me in welcoming Hamish to the front to speak on the topic of transforming transparency, clarifying higher education for all. Hamish Coates.
Thank you very much, David, for perhaps an overly generous introduction, but appreciated nonetheless. And to colleagues for joining me this evening, and to indeed the Graduate School of Education for the invitation to deliver hopefully a lecture which takes stock somewhat on some of that 16 years and prior, but also looks forward a little bit into what might be engaging some of our thinking for the next 16 plus years. And probably 16 is a good number to hang some of the talk on, and I'll continue to do so as I continue to talk through the night. And I'd just like to pay particular acknowledgement to my mother up there, with whom I wouldn't have got this far, and also my supervisor, Professor Richard James, who, as always, for a supervisor, gets the last comment. So, along with Richard, I will be referencing the work of many. You can't do large-scale work in education unless you collaborate and work with lots and lots of people, and in the field of higher education from lots and lots of different cultures. And it's very important to pay acknowledgement to all of those fantastic brains who have contributed to some of the projects and outcomes that I'm going to talk about. I'll start by just putting some context across. Most particularly, I want to refer to this concept of smarter higher education. There's often debates within the field of higher education about what is higher about higher education. I'm going to refer to smarter higher education as an opening concept, and then talk about transparency, the word that was listed in the title of the lecture, before then focusing on some of the work that I've been involved with colleagues for over a decade in terms of creating new insights, and then finally looking at what I'm referring to next generation reports by way of concluding the lecture tonight. So first of all, the idea of smarter higher education, and I'd like to invite you just to start by thinking about how you selected the subjects that you did at school. When you were embarking on that very important phase of your schooling, when you were making decisions, do I go down this track or that track? Where's it going to get me? How am I going to perform? What are the externalities around all of those considerations? What on earth am I going to do with the balance of my schooling, and where's it going to take me? Very difficult series of considerations. And of course then there's the very difficult and vexed issue about what to do after school, and there's all sorts of contingencies surrounding that, and I've been reminded of them today doing 2 radio interviews because there's a lot of results being released around this time of year and people are making all sorts of decisions, and of course they always seem a lot more important in the immediate now than they end up playing out across the rest of a career. Because of course, even if you're lucky enough to get to a good tertiary institution and complete a degree, what on earth do you do afterwards? And we know now that many people, including myself, will keep learning and doing qualifications, hopefully no more for me, as we travel through our career, and indeed as the career varies. And jobs and careers are so varied across the lifespan. And in fact, an even further and more complex series of considerations in terms of our thinking about how we build that career across 30 or 40 or 50 years of professional work. But unfortunately, we work in an industry that is very imperfect in terms of providing the advice, the information to people to help them form their considerations about what to do. And I'll just put up some very recent clippings that really indicate that, as economists would say, we have some degree of market failure. We are just not optimising how we get people engaged in their best future educationally, let alone into the workforce after they've finished. All of these are stories and clippings taken out of, admittedly, the higher education industry media by and large, but do indicate that even despite the best efforts, the current Labor Party policy pitch, even despite the best efforts and the best experts and oodles of money and wisdom, we're not yet doing as well as we might in terms of essentially providing the guidance to our institutions, our teachers or our students most particularly, and in many cases their parents, because we know that a lot of the tertiary decision making for school even in Australia happens around the age of 16, and parents are intimately involved in that, so that we can make sure we're giving the best guidance to people as they go through their life. And of course, ultimately this has the capacity to lead to failure. So from that series of complexities at the start, I'd like you now to go forward to some point in the future. Maybe 30 years. Last year, it seemed like very last year to us in Australia when the Education Minister indicated that he might provide a 20% cut to the base funding. In some countries such as Japan, this is real. Last week, I encountered a PhD student in Russia who's studying university failure. And I said, how many universities are failing in Russia? And he said, potentially hundreds. This is a current consideration in many contexts and places around the world. It's obviously not optimal for those of us who are deeply committed to higher education. For those of us who think higher education is the path to helping people through research and teaching do a lot better for themselves, their family and their community. It's not optimal in terms of helping us understand the value that higher education adds to the community all around the world. But essentially what we're seeing is a change in higher education. We're seeing a shift from government-regulated systems to the emergence of a competitive market that's challenged by principally, and these are the two debates in currently the world's preeminent higher education system, the US, to do with accountability and affordability, the two tensions. How we fund higher education and how we ensure that we get good quality processes in terms of teaching and student experience and outcomes for students. So from that bleak point in the future, and I gave you a few alternatives, but I'm sure you all selected your own moment in time when this might be a possible reality. I want you now to think about how we could do better now improving the value of higher education. And deeply aware that I'm very likely preaching to the choir in terms of saying that higher education has an enormous value for us and our communities and our industries, etc. But of course, many don't necessarily feel that way. When we look at the policy emphasis that's given to higher education, when we look at how people make decisions about where to study, it's very clear that there's a very series of ambivalent or uncertain conversations about the value associated with higher education. So I want instead to refer to how we can go about demonstrating the value of higher education, how we can have a discussion about the value of higher education that's informed not just by rhetoric or marketing or aspiration or prestige or reputation, but instead informed by data. And it's a move that's happened somewhat successfully in some areas relative to others. It's a move that's increasingly international, and it's a move that I want to talk about in the balance of the presentation. And I'll say why. Essentially, we could simplistically conceptualise higher education as having a supply side and a demand side. And there are all sorts of students and stakeholders over on our right. And then on the left-hand side, we've got governments who play an enormous role in higher education in most countries, not all, but in most countries. We have, of course, higher education institutions, and we've had these things that have been developed over the last 3 decades, but certainly only over the last 3 decades, called quality agencies, and they take a variety of forms, professional associations and various other forms of accreditation organisations. The decks are shifting. Quality agencies are really on the nose. In fact, in this country, our quality agency was closed down a couple of years ago. A new accreditation agency was put in place that doesn't do quality. Debates in the United States, as I'll show, are moving steadily in that direction. Essentially, the job of the quality agency was to provide a layer of trust to the public on how higher education is performing. And in many advanced economies, it's argued quite cogently that that layer of trust, that barrier, that job of the quality agency simply isn't working anymore. What we see emerging is new forms of transparency technology. And we probably have a transparency technology in our right or left pocket or in our hand currently. And through that, we can access all sorts of things, including, I was advised today, reference of this lecture on Twitter, which I learned about from someone else. I don't myself tweet. You may be tweeting. There may be transparency going on right now, and indeed, this will be transparently up on the web. We are now very much front and centre of the people that we're intersecting with higher education. We are not many steps removed in terms of the provision that we're providing to students. Curriculum has had its transparency moment. MIT and Stanford, etc., through the open courseware movement 15, 20 years ago, were really at the bleeding edge of that. And the concept of MOOC is just one more instantiation of that development of technology that's happened for the last 20 or so years. Pedagogy, teaching, is becoming more transparent, not least through the ubiquitous update of learning management systems. Through that we can see much more clearly what people are doing in terms of their teaching, and you only have to walk just about 100 metres up the road to see a lecture theatre on Swanston Street, where you can watch the lecture taking shape as students are sitting there listening to it. But there are still some areas of higher education that are far less transparent than they should be, and those are the areas that I want to talk about primarily, and then finally turning to how we can do better in terms of explaining what we do to people so that they can make informed decisions, so that they can understand the value, the enormous value that higher education contributes to society and to themselves and to their communities and professions and industries. Here's another media piece. It's just from October 8. CSHE is the main quality assurance agency in the US. It's probably the most advanced quality assurance system in the world. It's certainly the longest. And here is a newsflash that they sent through a couple of weeks ago, just suggesting how CSHE was responding to the suggestion by a couple of senators in the US where higher education transparency has become a mainstream political issue in the current presidential race, that there needs to be more disclosure about what students are learning as part of their university studies. And I'll return to some more remarks about that as I progress, and also some specific examples where some transparency initiatives have been developed, and indeed where some transparency initiatives around student learning outcomes are taking very interesting berths as they move in beyond the research phase into full institutionalisation on a global scale. So essentially, this is the premise that I am taking to the talk. In an elite higher education system, small-scale institutions, you can indeed run the business of the university and education with almost no reference to data. It was invariably the way things were done 50 years ago because there was just a paucity of data. In the 70s and 80s, I believe there was paper-based returns between universities and the federal ministry in Canberra. These days, of course, it's much more seamless, but still it's not as seamless as it is in many corporations that can run their enterprise globally. There's still only a series of returns throughout the year between universities and their funding and quality assurance bodies. As we move into a mass higher education system, we start to see the emergence of different forms of data. But really, my interest is what happens when we go beyond that tipping point and look at much broader forms of institution and system, much bigger environments where we have universal levels of participation. We have staff teaching who haven't necessarily been doing it for many years or been doing it in an institutional context at all. And we need to start having much better evidence on what is going on, and most particularly on what is being achieved. And that goes to the idea of transparency. Now, transparency is something that's usually used as a weapon in the public policy discourse in terms of code for corruption, mitigating corruption, understanding how we can move through corruption, or various other forms of malbehaviour by institutions, systems, or people. I want to instead put a different slant on the concept of transparency, and it's about value creation. The idea is that by talking more about what we do and the value we add to people, we have the capacity to demonstrate the enormous value being yielded through higher education. And I guess it's a trite example, but it's a very important example, and I'm certainly not making a comment on the contingent politics of last year, but the very idea that a $100,000 degree slogan is able to get political traction demonstrates how superficial our capacity to demonstrate value to the polity really is. $100,000 is a remarkably good investment in a higher education qualification by almost any measure, one would think, if one does the sums. And of course the sums are done, but the sums are done by insiders, and I'll say some more about that as we progress. So I'm posing this as my main conceptual lens, if you like. The idea is not that we're just looking at mitigating corruption. Of course there's corrupt practice in Australia and other systems around the world. But that's a different set of conversations. Instead, I'm looking at how we can do better in terms of enhancing the productivity of what we're doing, that is, doing things cheaper, and also enhancing the quality of what we do, that is, doing things better. I've spoken to much of this, but I'll just recap it in the interests of really affirming the main contention that I want to put forward tonight. The traditional ways in which we've disclosed as higher education participants what we do have been essentially designed for a supply-driven, regulated type of market arrangement, to use the economic terms. The shift from systems to markets and into more competitive environments essentially means we need radically new forms of disclosure. Disclosure that make people uncomfortable. Moves towards greater transparency in recent decades haven't gone nearly far enough. And there are various reasons for that, but there are many more reasons why we need to do substantially more that's happened. And indeed, there are intrinsic and extrinsic reasons for that. We should want to be transparent, but as well, if we are transparent, it will do better in terms of disclosing the value that we add, as I've argued already. So if we then start to think, well, what on earth is transparency? Well, there's been, in higher education, there's been a bit of work done in Europe, in fact, quite a lot of work, where it's been essential to have more awareness and disclosure about what institutions and graduates and students and teachers and institutions and ministers are doing as you try and form the European higher education area. And there are now a very interesting series of conversations going on in Europe about how successful that 15-year Bologna experience has been and whether it's worth continuing, and if so, in what form. So if you step outside of higher education and you look at the broader literature around transparency, and most of it is outside higher education, you can come up with a series of principles about what counts for transparency. And I'll talk briefly through them because they're absolutely essential to us as the insiders in this conversation, designing a future where higher education is understood better by particularly those people who don't like higher education. And there are, I regret to say, some. First of all, the information should be robust. It's got to be good quality data. And higher education institutions, as a psychometrician, do have a penchant for occasionally purchasing information that is less well regarded technically than would be allowed in their own inherent research processes. It must be robust, but it must also be assured. Why? Because we can't trust ourselves. Okay? And we shouldn't be in a position where we're saying, trust us. The information should be relevant and accessible. What does that mean? It means that people should be able to access the information, and it should be timely information, and it should be relevant to them. The information should be timely and ongoing. So it should be a real feed of information, not information that's 3 or 4 years late. And it should be ongoing. It should be information that's supplied on a real basis, real-time basis. Institutions and people should want to supply the information, and it should be done so in a way which is relevant to the stakeholder. I'll show you further on how we've managed to make that exactly the opposite of much of what we do in higher education. And finally, the regulation of information is absolutely essential. One only has to point to the global rankings movement to see a series of disclosure mechanisms which are incredibly powerful and incredibly unregulated. And finally, if people lie, there should be some means of sanctioning that adverse behaviour and making them accountable. So, what are some ways in which we've tried to build some new insights into higher education? Well, we're currently working on a very interesting piece of research for the Australian government where we're saying, what on earth is the way that students see their higher education now in Australia? And these are the kind of concepts that we're coming up with. These are the kind of things that we're finding out about in terms of what students are saying matters to them in terms of their higher education, and I'll quickly talk through them. Do I belong? Do I front up to an organisation with 10, 20, 30, 40,000 students? We have big universities in Australia. And do I belong? Is my experience highly personalised, or is it full of hassle factor created by big bureaucracies which I just simply don't understand? Do I get real-time updates as to how I should be interacting with my learning and my broader experience? Do I feel enabled in terms of what I'm doing? Am I being led to discover things? And discovery is not just the name of a grant application scheme run by the ARC, it's something that every single student must be doing as part of their learning. Am I getting connected to communities within my institution and outside my institution? Am I finding new experiences and linkages between the sort of things that I'm doing? Is it a valuable experience? Fundamentally, is it worth 4-5 years of my life in terms of the cost, time and effort? Is it providing me with opportunities? And of course, am I actually achieving something? These are new terms. They're not terms that are part of our national discourse about higher education. We currently have several other terms, many of which I'll refer to in the slides that come. But these sort of terms challenge us to think about how students are wondering about, and their parents and their communities are wondering about higher education, are wondering about what we do and deliver as part of our everyday work. So I'd like to invite us to think in the next section of the presentation about the data that exists to support these kinds of indicators. And I'm going to briefly talk through a handful of different forms of data. And I should say much of the indicators that I just talked about can indeed be described and explained with reference to these available data in Australia. But of course, if we start to look outside Australia, things get much more complex. So one piece of work that I've been passionate about for at least the last 20 years, since with Richard we started thinking about redeveloping this thing called the Course Experience Questionnaire and taking it outside the classroom in 1999, is understanding how students engage in higher education. And we have in the room Wen Wang visiting us from Tsinghua, who has been involved, I'm delighted to say, in the world's biggest higher education survey, the China College Student Survey, of which there is a chapter in that book, which talks about how the world's now biggest higher education system, China, is taking steps to think about just that issue. We start to see these conversations taking place, not just in Australia, not just in America, but indeed, I think currently in about 20 other higher education systems. And there they are. And the red countries are simply the countries where we have national type data available, and the green countries are countries where we have just a small data on just a small number of institutions. And the graph indeed has probably grown to include more countries in recent years. So this is the kind of insight that we can get when we start to ask these types of questions. And this is a graph that I prepared, 2010, for the Lomax-Smith review, which at the time gave the government the only cross-national data that they had access to on how students were experiencing and achieving and performing and being supported by their institutions in the higher education. And so here we have a series of institutions that I've accessed from public sources. I had access to confidential data, but that wouldn't have been appropriate, not an appropriate form of transparency. And really, this is the graph that created a lot of energy around suggesting that we're simply not having the funds available in Australia to employ the staff to provide a student staff experience, which of course, as anyone involved in education knows, is absolutely fundamental to quality. Even compared, or particularly compared with benchmark systems like Canada, these are just some institutions, and I should say the institutions are institutions which all fancy benchmarking against themselves in other areas of their lives. So we can start to have some quite new conversations at the time about student engagement, which has now become institutionalised in terms of roles and policies, etc. And we can start to pinpoint areas in which our institution could well be doing better or comparable compared with other institutions. This is perhaps one of the most pressing areas in terms of developing new insights into higher education. And it's something with a very controversial history in Australia because it's an inherently complex and difficult matter to progress. How do we model the performance of what universities add to students and their learning? And there's a tradition built up through the US and UK. I see Tony Brick is speaking here in just a couple of weeks, I think, who's been fundamental to building that tradition in the US context, as has Harvey Goldstein in the UK context, in terms of thinking through how we measure the value added to individual students by higher education. And you've probably, if you attend to the US media, heard of a few pieces of relatively popular academic, fiction, but research, I think, which has shown that very little value is added by higher education in America. In fact, it's been a lot of the energy that's prompted some of the movements towards reporting student learning in the higher education debates in the US. Last year, I worked with the RAND Corporation to do a piece of work in the UK, which has now led to about 12 pilots being funded that are looking at just this issue. So what is the issue? The issue is essentially if we receive students with a certain level of knowledge and graduate them with other knowledge, we can for sure get measures of performance on each of those assessments. And the assessments may well be a senior secondary certificate, an ATAR, a GAMSAT, an aptitude test of some sort. It could be an IELTS, it could be social advantage. And then we graduate them with different sorts of outcomes. And we can rank ourselves on each of those, but what we're really concerned about is whether or not people have done better or worse than they should have. And the word should there is where the controversy begins. But ultimately, if we want to have some insight as to how much has been gained by higher education, 3-4 years of study, this is the kind of conversation and the kind of evidence that we need to start figuring out how we can make robust and have all those pretty principles that I talked about in terms of transparency. Pretty quickly, we then start to shift towards conversations about affordability. And we had this conversation in Australia last year regarding the deregulation of price associated with student tuition fees and indeed the shift in the who pays dynamic from government to households. But we didn't really have it because the policy didn't go through. But we certainly saw how nasty and rugged some of these debates can quickly become. And how indeed they would have been much better informed by research evidence if we had had some pretty transparent information about how affordable it is to study in Australian higher education. In fact, this can be very difficult information to find, even on our government websites, and particularly for people who know nothing about higher education, and regrettably, particularly for people who have no family background in higher education and may well have a disadvantage in terms of their capacity to find that information. And of course, there's all sorts of ways that we contribute. There's upfront cash contributions, debt repayments, whatever form of debt that may be, and then of course, opportunity costs. There's an excellent piece of work done on this about 15 years ago by Peter Dawkins and his colleagues at the Melbourne Institute, which regrettably hasn't yet resulted in fully transparent information on the costs and returns of higher education to students in Australia. Interestingly, last week I just learnt about some work being done by the Gallup organisation nationally in America, which is starting to look at some of those more intangible issues to do with health and economic and social outcomes that we have often struggled to define properly. Of course, if we're going to demonstrate value, we need to look pretty particularly about what people have learned. And one of my core areas there has been assessment, as David mentioned at the start. How can we improve the assessment of student learning in the classroom, but most importantly, how can we demonstrate that knowledge to external audiences of varying sorts? And this is an area that we've progressed through a range of projects in different countries and different institutions. Why? Well, it was actually a remark made by my mother, to whom I referred to before, when I went to sit an exam last November up in the exhibition buildings. I got home and I got a picture of the Sydney University exam hall. Wilson Hall burnt down, so I couldn't find a picture of it easily, but I believe it would have looked something like this if it was seated up for an exam in 1905. And after the papers had been collected from my exam, along with everyone else in the room, I got my mobile phone and I took a picture of the seating of the exam hall. And I wondered if indeed we had reached the pinnacle of assessment technology, particularly given all of the further changes that we've seen in higher education. More diverse students, teaching has been transformed, curricula's transformed, and yet we're still essentially doing assessment in fundamentally the same way that we were 100 and obviously longer, many more years ago before that. And I should add, I really didn't think that that way of assessing my economics knowledge, were I to go on and work in the finance sector, would give me the integrity and the nous to save me and my organisation from the next financial crisis. I was just thinking, is this really how we're going to determine whether or not I'm performing? And of course, there are much more technical reasons why we want to improve assessment. Just recently, I've run an experiment within a university where we got some marks and we sent them to different graders, and we did indeed get results like this. And immediately, when you show that around the table, there's silence. And everyone has a deep moral concern about the poor student who got 75 when the rater, who subsequently came and moderated that work, gave them 95. That has enormous potential for people's life outcomes, and we need to be doing better. So various initiatives are underway, and this is one of the most important ones. It's probably the biggest higher education project in the world, and with some regret, my only contact with it is the director of the project is a very dear friend of mine, Robert Wagner. And he has managed over the last 15 years to get academics all around the world talking about the sameness and the commonality of students' learning outcomes. You might notice there's a big area on the map where there hasn't been these discussions. But they will soon happen because Tuning Asia has just begun. And soon we will see some of the world's very large higher education systems, Indonesia with 5 million students and India with many more than that, starting to have conversations about benchmarking what we expect students to achieve. But expectation is one thing, performance is another. And if we start to go that next step further and say, we want some evidence on what's been achieved, not just some rhetoric on what our students should achieve, we start to venture into exceedingly controversial territory. And I had the pleasure for 4 years of designing and implementing this study for the OECD, probably now global in its infamy, but certainly also has put the concept of assessing learning outcomes on the international map. If you talk about higher education, learning outcomes assessment, everyone, it would appear, knows this acronym, and everyone is thinking about how we can do the next study, including the OECD, the next study a lot better than we did the feasibility study 5 years ago. So what we did, and the colours just simply reflect the different strands and areas of testing that countries took part in, engineering, generic skills, or economics. What we did is we designed tests and gave them to final year graduates. We gave the test to graduates to 25,000 students, near to graduates just a month before they graduated or so, in 250 universities in those particular countries, and collected the information and provided reports back to university presidents which gave insight into how students at their university were learning relative to international benchmarks, which have never before, and I partly regret to say, never again been received by them. So we're starting to benchmark how students have performed, and of course that sort of information, which was tightly held under confidentiality principles with the universities, has the game-changing potential to reshape how we think about higher education, particularly for those 95% plus of the world's 18,000 universities and other higher education institutions that simply don't have research as their primary business, but are currently playing to a ranking and disclosure system that emphasises research performance first and foremost. So what's going on in this space? Well, really interesting stuff, actually. The OECD has struggled to get countries interested in progressing its own work, but if we look around the world, we can see all sorts of very interesting things happening with major higher education systems. Stanford University is perhaps running, in my mind, the most interesting, with colleagues at ETS, where they're looking across 30 universities in Russia, 30 in China and 30 in the States in computer science and electrical engineering. And in just those fields, which are relatively easy to define across cultures and languages, looking at how students are performing, and that's soon to go into the field, and it's being run by communities of scholars around the world at leading institutions in each of those countries. I've already referred to the HEFCE work, which has been funded to look at learning gains, which invariably involves looking at all forms of assessment and how we can capture measures of value added. The European Commission announced funding led by Robert Wagner, who I referred to before, who runs the Tuning Academy, which in collaboration with ETS is running this project comparing achievement and learning outcomes across higher education institutions in Europe, and I believe there are about 200 involved. And the next step, of course, beyond that will be to expand out those conversations beyond European borders. And for about the last 5 years, the German Federal Ministry has put many millions of euros into strengthening the assessment of students learning in Australian higher education. But with some regret, I have to acknowledge that while Australia was early off the starting blocks in this field in 2000s and in the late 2000s, around 2010, there has not been very little interest in following the lead of these major higher education systems in terms of carving out new evidence in this fundamentally very important area of higher education, student learning and achievement. We do have, of course, remarkably good information about employment outcomes. The Graduate Destination Survey has given us that for some years. And in 2008, it was an absolute pleasure to start looking not just 6 months out, as does the Graduate Destination Survey, but 3 and 5 years out. And you start to get all sorts of absolutely amazing insights into what happens as the people's careers take off after they conclude a bachelor's degree. Here's just one example. The differential of male and female salaries actually gets worse, substantially worse, over 5 years. And of course, the situation is worse than we would understand if all we did was look 6 months out. And it's absolutely fantastic that the new national data collection has now shifted to try and get 3-year out insights from our graduates. But increasingly, we're starting to see that low response rates to these external assessments, about 80% of students tend to ignore them, means that we have to look at the data, the enormous reservoirs of data within universities. Very sensitive area in terms of privacy, confidentiality and complexity. And for those of you who also saw Gregor Kennedy's inaugural professorial lecture earlier this year, he talked in depth about a case study or several case studies involving this kind of data. But it is absolutely imperative that we start to understand this data better, because this is the evidence that we need to understand how students are learning, how we can support them, and how we can help develop the metrics of the future, those ones that I talked about earlier, prepare what are called dashboards, and then really importantly, start to prepare educationally and individually relevant interventions so that we can help people do their learning and achieve a lot more than they are otherwise currently doing. I'll just shift gears slightly for the last example before turning to look at reporting mechanisms. Engagement. If we think about the work of the university, some kind of institutional leadership function, community leadership within the institution, education, research and engagement. It's the least well defined. And we're currently embarked at the University of Melbourne, and CSHE's role in this is to do training for our staff to help them improve this facet of their work in terms of building the capability required for engagement. But these are just some very early thought bubbles about what the desired outcomes are, what the various processes are, and hence what sort of inputs, resources and people and development, etc., would be required to progress in this area. And I just want to continue this line of thinking with an example of how much there is for higher education to progress in this area. Triple bottom line reporting, people, place, profit reporting, almost ubiquitous in the corporate world. 95% of the world's 250 largest firms produce what we could otherwise refer to as a sustainability report. And yet, only 86 of the 18,000 universities in the world have done this. Many are now, of course, making very fervent endeavours to do so. And we've seen in some of the public conversations, not least the VW saga, how important this line of thinking and work is to organisations and the communities with which they intersect. If we take the global benchmark standard, the Global Reporting Initiative, and apply it to our sector, as it is applied to so many other sectors, we can start to see that there are so many stories that we are not telling about what we are doing to our communities and who our communities are. The fact that the University of Melbourne, for example, is the second largest employer in the state of Victoria probably isn't widely known outside of some very small insider circles, and that's an enormously powerful story that we should be telling. So on to reports. Well, I've said much already about how we're going wrong and not getting things quite right despite our best endeavours, and how we could be doing less. And I'm not going to spend time now going through, if you like, some of these limitations of current reports, but needless to say, we do need to start aspiring to be solving some of these issues. What's been the journey so far? Well, my earlier thinking is when I went to exchange in Canada in the 90s, I went to an office here, it was pre-internet, pre-email, and looked at a paper-based report of several universities that I might consider attending. In the 2000s, indeed during the time almost that I was in Canada, the web took off. And we started to have university websites produce information about all sorts of aspects of higher education. And indeed, the current rankings and many of the current disclosure mechanisms that we do have in higher education were invented. We've started to see in the last 5 years what we could refer to as third generation reports, which are much more dynamic and individually nuanced in terms of providing the information that I started the lecture by referring to. And I'm inviting us now to think about what these sorts of disclosure mechanisms might look like in the next 5 years and beyond. If we take stock of the current ecosystem in this space, it's incredibly complex, even for people deeply involved in higher education. And generally speaking, it provides information on who we are, not what we can do for others, and what we're delivering even more broadly. So essentially, we're still, with the exception of a few of these very prominent mechanisms, we're still talking about ourselves, not inviting other people to learn how we can help them. And needless to say, this is a very confusing array of reports. Doesn't satisfy many of the principles. Even some of the most legitimated reports that hang off the White House webpage, for example, don't satisfy many of the transparency principles I referred to before. So I'm going to work towards conclusion by talking about some of those principles that we need to be searching for in terms of our future ways of disclosing the enormous value that we add to people, and the fact that we need to be providing reports that are much more personalised, much more dynamic and much more graphical in terms of how we understand people as individuals and what they seek as very complex individuals who are essentially transformed by their time in higher education and what they seek to achieve. And the danger of us providing too much information or providing information that misguides people is probably not going to be with us with some joy or regret for many years to come, given the paucity of information that is out there. So it's probably, if we're careful in terms of following these principles, not a risk that we misinform or that others misinform about us, because increasingly this debate is not being run by universities, it's being run by other organisations and increasingly not by governments. the risk of us or others misinforming about higher education is probably not something that we're going to face soon. So where is the growth? Where is the growth potential for doing better in this area? Well, we need to provide reports that have more scope. They need to be more comprehensive. They can't just provide reports on research and various other forms of reputation. Certainly information about education must be in there, and we do have that information available for many thousands of universities around the world. So one wonders why it hasn't made its way into the popular rankings. And also information about engagement and about what universities are, that engagement or sustainability dimension. These reports must be more sophisticated, as I've said, and as well, they need to adhere to and indeed recreate. It's our job as higher education institutions and researchers to define new forms of transparency and set new standards in this area. So we have a problem, which I've sketched. I've tried to sketch a proposal, but of course, if we look at the idea of policy entrepreneurship, politics, particularly in higher education, invariably plays a role to inventing or opening what we can refer to and what Mitram refers to as a policy window. What are the opportunities for doing this and who's going to take the lead? Currently, it would appear, as I said, it's not universities. So it's probably a debate and an opportunity that we need to take back. And there are substantial opportunities to innovate in this growing field, not just in Australia, but indeed it's an international game almost by definition. And once we seek to make this change and achieve some change by providing more information about what people are doing and achieving, we can start to see all sorts of things would flow from this. And of course there are risks, but having developed dozens of large-scale data collections and very high-stakes data collections for universities and other institutions, I've yet to see the sky fall in from new forms of data that invite people to think new and different thoughts about higher education. This is perhaps, for me, the most important change. We have the potential to try and head off some of that market failure that must be occurring because we're not providing as cogent or compelling information as we could be about the enormous value that people have to gain from higher education. So a brief recap. I started by talking about some of those complexities where not doing higher education and disclosing what we're doing as well as we could be in terms of how we're talking about its value. And transparency, I said, is absolutely key to making that shift. Understanding new forms of transparency in how we report what we do, particularly to people who don't have a vested interest in higher education. So we need to create new insights, and I've given some case studies about some areas that have been progressed by me and many, many colleagues, and if you're keen to follow up on any of them, I can certainly send you some reports. I'll put you in touch with other people. But there are many more insights that we do need to create, and probably most pressing amongst those is information about what the students are learning and achieving, and we need to be giving very careful thought to thinking about how we can report that information and do so in ways that are highly individual, dynamic and engaging to people all across the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hamish, and thank you, Hamish's mother. Hamish has very clearly laid out an argument for a better understanding of the value of higher education, for more disclosure and for more transparency. And he was keen to point out that he was not implying that tertiary institutions are behaving in a clandestine way, because clearly most are not. Although interestingly today, the ACCC has begun federal action against a VET provider, I'm pleased to say, not a higher education provider. The provider is called Unique International College. And they've been very cleverly, by the look of things, harvesting VET fee help revenue by clearly not disclosing the character of what they're offering. An extreme example, perhaps. But returning to Hamish's lecture, clearly disclosure and transparency from Hamish's point of view, is heavily oriented towards data and reporting, as it must be in these circumstances. And Australia, I think, has been inching in this direction. We started doing this in many ways because of a belief that market mechanisms would push up quality. If prospective students and their families were making more informed decisions about higher education, this would have effects on institutional behaviours and, in the usual market mechanism, ultimately push up quality. I don't think we've yet seen any real evidence of that happening. And it's been a fraught period. Let me choose another extreme example. The Good Universities Guide takes some of our existing data and uses it in a quite appalling way to purportedly inform prospective students and their families and their schools and so on about the character of courses and institutions. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, the Good Universities Guide takes student survey data and creates a 5-star to 1-star rating system, which is based on ranking the courses and institutions and then splitting them into quintiles. And if you happen to be in the top quintile, you get 5 stars, and if you happen to be in the lowest quintile, you get 1 star. This is a dramatic misrepresentation, of course, of the underlying differences between institutions on these surveys. Most students are very satisfied with their higher education outcomes. In fact, on overall satisfaction ratings, typically institutions get 80% satisfied or above. But as I say, if you happen to be in the lowest quintile, you'll be represented as a 1-star institution by the Good Universities Guide. I use that rather lengthy example just to highlight how imperfect and in some ways impoverished the present representation of existing data is in Australia and perhaps beyond. So yes, we need to do better, that's true, and I think we can all agree with Hamish's thesis there. But we have to be cautious about this, and I just want to throw 3 ideas to you to start up a conversation for when we head out for drinks. The first is to do with the dark matter, as it's been referred to, of higher education, the things that are beyond measurement and representation. How on earth do we make sense of the massive volume of dark matter? I'll just give you a personal anecdote here. I would say that my most transformative higher education experience was one that I would never have known about through any form of data representation that I might have received beforehand. It's a micro level experience rather than a macro level experience, if I can put it that way. So how do we make the most of the data without claiming that it represents everything, without claiming that it represents the dark matter, as I'll call it? Second point is to do with interpretation, and Hamish moved on to this point in his closing remarks, and I'm sure would have much more to say about this if he had time. When it comes to interpretation of data and reports, context is everything. So what is useful, meaningful, relevant to an urban student might have different forms of meaning and relevance to a rural student or an Indigenous student or an international student for that matter. And Hamish spoke about the need for personalised information and, if you like, a bespoke means of interpreting whatever information is available. This is an admirable quest. It seems to me an extremely difficult point to get to, given human diversity. And finally, my third attempt to get conversation going over drinks is to do with what I'll describe as a paradox, and that is, in many ways, higher education is a complex business. The outcomes are complex. In many ways, you need to have higher education to understand higher education. So how on earth do you get to a point where people who have not reached a point of education about education can make sense of the reports and the numbers and the data that are put before them? So I invite you to take up my 3 points of discussion very soon. I'm going to end with a small piece of disclosure, and that is Hamish mentioned that in his opinion a $100,000 degree was good value. I just want to make it clear that that's Professor Hamish Coates' opinion. It is not representative of my view or the University of Melbourne's position on $100,000 degrees. I must say it was really an awful scare tactic that was used within the sector, regardless of whether or not you personally feel that $100,000 is good value or not. So finally, before handing back to David Beckett, can I thank the Graduate School of Education for this fine series of lectures that we've had this year. They're not over, and I think David will tell you more about the lectures to follow. So please join me in thanking Hamish for a fine Dean's lecture this evening.